Welcome to Voices Unlocked. I'm Conrad Stewart, your co-host today with Pam Bailey. More Than Our Crimes is producing this podcast, and our whole mission is to bring the humanity side back to incarceration for individuals who won't be returning to society one day. Today's on Voices Unlocked, we doing part one of a two-part episode dealing with lockdowns in the federal institutions and how they affect the individuals behind the walls. First of all, we got to understand what these lockdowns are. You have what is known as a full lockdown and a modified lockdown in the Federal Bureau of Prisons. And most of these are in the penitentiaries. For majority of my stay in the BOP, I was in these penitentiaries and I understood the effect that it had on programming and rehabilitating. So the full lockdown, what you have is where the whole institution locked down. There's no kitchen workers. There's no one going to work, but the whole institution is locked down and the police or the correctional officers, excuse me, are doing all the work. So that means they are preparing the food. They're taking the inmates back and forth from showering. They are doing all the daily essential things that inmates normally do. It's now dependent upon the police to bring you them food, get their clothes, their mail, etc. And this lockdown means that we're in the cell for 24 hours, 7 days a week. They may have the TVs on, they may not. So that means that it's just you and another individual locked in the cell all day long. And like I say, if you don't understand the psychological effect of us being social creatures and understand that we are developed mentally and psychologically through our learned experience, if these experiences only experience of one individual that you're in the cell with, what type of mind are we actually producing? So today we're going to understand this full lockdown, which I just explained to you, and the modified lockdowns is somewhat similar, but you do come out for an hour in the morning and you might come out for an hour in the evening on these modified lockdowns, but nevertheless, you're still confined to either your pod or your housing unit. And in this case, they do let some workers out for essential uses like laundry, food, commissary, but you're still confined to this small little space only for a few hours coming out your cell. Then you return back to your cell, whatever the time that they dictate and say is necessary for us to go back into our cells. And this was done primarily, I had did 26 years. So primarily, I would say the last 10 years of my incarceration, was the functioning of the prisons. This was the function of the BOP, penitentiaries, and FCIs. This is how they function, and this is how they ran their institutions for over 10 years now. I was just explaining to Pam how in 2010, me myself, I was in Coleman 2, USP, which is in Florida. And in 2010, we was only out our cell for 155 days. So that means out of 365 days, we was out our cell 55 days. The other half, we was in our cell on some type of modified lockdown. The warden at that time, he had it in his mind that anytime something would happen, meaning that anytime there was an incident or emergency within the institution, they have a code that the COs use. We call it the deuces, right? Because you can hear it, it has this unique sound. And that's letting you know when you hear that, you'll hear the keys start jiggling from the police because they're responding to some type of incident. But it's only a code that the COs use in order to notify other COs that they have an incident in a particular part of the institutions. And when we hear this, we already know 9 times out of 10, they're gonna say lockdown, return to your cells. Well, however, in 2010, the warden at the institution, who was I believe it was Warden Drew, he made it in his mind. He told us every time the deuces go off, this is what he said before anything ever happened. He said every time the deuces go off, you're going in the cell for 10 days. We didn't like it, the staff didn't like it, but that's the way he ran his institution. And I want to just, throw it out there to y'all. Is this justified? Is this security or is this just, abuse of authority? So that's what some of the modifiers that I encountered in there. And then, like I say, the whole lockdowns was common because when I went to USP Big Sandy in 2016, and it's ironic how all the institutions where DC residents is housed in the Federal Bureau of Prisons, these are the most restricted institutions out of all. And I had went to Big Sandy, which is in Kentucky. And in Big Sandy, soon I got there, they was on lockdown. I was only there, I believe I was only there for 6 months. And I wasn't out to sell maybe, I don't know how. I think I was there about, I take that back. I was there for almost 12 months. But out of those 12 months, I believe 9 to 10 months we was locked down. So this shows you the inconsistencies of the prison, and it shows you how the institutions are abusing this method of control of inmates. And like I say, it's just kind of ironic that all the institutions that DC prisoners go to, particularly, are the ones that is most used to use these methods. So I just wanted to fill y'all in and let y'all know that that's just some of the things that's going on and how it's really breaking the spirit of a lot of individuals who will return to society, and we will need these individuals to, contribute as citizens.
Yeah, and actually, I started hearing about lockdowns, which, there's a lot of information in the news lately about solitary confinement, and usually when you hear solitary confinement, they're talking about something called the hole, or the special housing unit, and that's where people are sent mostly for punishment, and that's when people talk about solitary confinement. But the lockdowns have actually blurred the line
Mhm.
between general population, where everybody is, and the whole. So it's like punishment is now throughout the entire institution. And I've heard that it's actually started getting worse, maybe 2018, 2017, and the COVID pandemic actually sort of solidified it and made it
Right.
institutionalized. And the prediction I was hearing from the people inside was that COVID would make it increasingly the norm. So, and that's proven to be true. The public health emergency has been declared ended,
Mhm.
but the lockdowns have continued as the norm, and you're going to hear about that. And actually, I've noticed you said it's mostly in the penitentiaries,
Mhm.
but I would say a lot of the guys in medium security prisons are also reporting lockdowns, mostly modified.
Right.
But you'll also hear that modified lockdowns can be just as disruptive as,
Mhm.
in their own way, as full. So the first interview is from the Coleman Penitentiary in Florida that you mentioned. Um, I I chose to interview somebody from there. It's actually where my co-founder Rob Barton currently is, because it's one of the worst when it comes to lockdowns, and it's particularly for full lockdowns.
Mhm.
Um, it feels to me like, because I have to communicate with my co-founder all the time, that it's like, it feels like most of the time, to be honest, that I cannot get through to them, because when they're on lockdown, they cannot communicate. They can't make phone calls. They can't do emails. Letters are the only thing. And very often, letters at Coleman are delayed, as
Right.
long delayed, or I may not even get them at all. So the first person I interviewed is named Artavius Love. And he starts off by talking about how it's become the norm.
The lockdowns are consistency. The only thing that is consistent is inconsistencies at Coleman. So I would say a 40% threshold of the time we're locked down. We're locked down mostly weekends, every weekend. And for whatever reason they deem that they're not able to facilitate the staff or whatever other reason, if the wind blows hard, we're locked down. The power might go out, or the cable might go out, or the thunder might crackle too loud. Sometimes we're locked down. Majority of the time is due to understaffing. So there's a problem there with the management side and staffing here, because the incentive is for people to work overtime. So they run like a skeleton crew of COs so that they can give them unlimited overtime. And when they decide they want to call out or take their leave, then they're understaffed, usually on weekends, holidays, and throughout the summer months.
Okay.
Mhm.
So the second interview I did is with Brooke Tolliver, who had the misfortune of going from one fire to another. He was in Coleman and then was transferred to the high security penitentiary called Hazleton in West Virginia, which is known as Misery Mountain for a reason. Now, as I mentioned before, as you heard, Coleman is known for full lockdowns for long periods of time. Hazleton is more modified lockdowns as a routine, but uh, all the time, never ending, and it can be just as bad. What Brooke talks about in this first interview, though, is something that people I don't think about. They hear about how bad solitary confinement is, being by yourself for long periods of time, which doesn't happen too often anymore. But he talks about when you're locked in your cell, a very small cell, for long periods of time or constantly, many hours a day, with somebody else, even somebody you get along with, it can be a real problem. Now, I want to mention that, as you think about this, try to imagine this yourself, like you're being locked into your room um, with either a best friend, or I have a friend who recently got to a new prison, and he was assigned to somebody who he had known before, and he used to tell me how much he couldn't stand him. And then when I heard they were locked in together, to be honest, I was a little afraid.
Right.
Knowing both those people like I do, they're both a little bit volatile.
Right.
Can you imagine then locking them together? That's potentially really dangerous. And Brooke makes that point, but says even if you get along, even if that person is a friend, if you're together too much in a very small space, it's an issue. So take a listen.
It's the bathroom. It's really like just a large porta potty. That's all it is. A large porta potty. That's, that's that's what a cell is. Because once you put a waste disposal device in the cell, that controls everything because you have stench coming out of there. You understand what I'm saying? And you have to keep that clean at all times. You have to constantly clean it. And some people don't go to that length. They just in the cell. And so that might bring cellies to blows like, oh man, you ain't cleaning the cell, or you have to deal with their personality. You know what I'm saying? When you by yourself, you can have time to think. You can write. You can do different things without disturbance. So you got people that come to a boiling point with their cellies.
What I believe a lot of people don't understand is that when you're incarcerated and you're doing time, 80% of you doing your time effective and efficiently has to do with your cell, your living conditions. Me personally, I knew in order for me to be able to study, to read, and be able to really just collect my thoughts and be efficient throughout the day, that my living conditions and my living quarters have to be organized. They have to be neat. And when you have an individual that you're not getting along with, or y'all have personality clashes, this interrupts your whole day. So even when it's time for you to call home, you have these things and these issues on your mind where you can't really enjoy the little freedom that you have in there, because now you constantly thinking about, dang, when I go on my celly, if I go on my cell, is my cellmate, is he gonna have, the room dirty, or have these foreign smells in the cell, and or is he gonna come talk to me a whole lot? Because a lot of times you might get a celly, the way they get through they during their time is that they want to talk and conversate and be social, and then when you're in that state of mind, especially if you're a critical thinker, and I stay in critical thought. So I want to be quiet. I want to
Yeah.
just get my thoughts. I want to grab a book. I want to study. I want to kind of like exercise my mind. And it's like you'll get these cellies with these different personalities, and then they'll take you wrong because you're quiet, and they think, oh, did I do something wrong, or did I offend you? But in
Yeah.
reality, you haven't even offended them. It's just that you want your personal space. So 80% of your doing your bid effectively or doing your time effectively, it starts off with the celly. And if you have a bad celly, and I was fortunate because like long periods of time where I was in, I didn't really have to deal with keep changing cellies because I learned how to adapt, and it's an ebb and flow when dealing with cellies. And once y'all communicate y'all habits and what you like to do, and like me, I used to stay to work. I like to work,
Yeah.
right? But everybody's not that fortunate, especially now we talking about in the era where you got modified lockdowns and full lockdowns. So it's very taxing mentally.
Yeah.
And then if a person is not really careful, it can be explosive.
It made me think of this related to maybe our normal lives. When you ride in an Uber,
Right.
there's actually an option. I don't know if people have noticed that. There's an option you can check to say, I don't want to talk. If you don't feel like talking, because some Uber drivers want to talk. Now, you have that option to say that, and then you're going to get out of the car, right?
Right.
Yeah, I mean, how often, Uber rides are usually pretty short. Well, so now imagine, however, you can't check that box, and
Right.
you're in the cell for 30, 40 days,
Right.
that would like sort of illustrate that. But what's interesting is that although normally, but again, people don't realize this, the only place you're actually truly by yourself is in an ADX, which is a supermax prison. That's for the, where the extreme prisons, for people they consider the worst troublemakers. In most cases, even in the hole, you have a cellie.
Right.
But there have been occasions when somebody's been by themselves, and they've really made that stricter now. Ever since Bernie Madoff, people have known him for you know,
Big
swindling people, right, out of billions of dollars. He committed suicide in his cell. And then actually the Unabomber, people have heard about it, also they think committed suicide. So they don't want that to happen because it causes very bad publicity. And the BOP, the Bureau of Prisons, doesn't want that. So a rule came down that basically said, do not allow anyone to be alone in their cell. And the bad part about that is that even when staff may know these two people shouldn't be together, they'll put them together. And that's when the real inflammatory part takes place.
And this is where the issue arises, because it's like they know it's a volatile situation, but however, they only intervene after the fact, and then when they intervene after the fact, because you got guys like when I was in the shoot, which is a special housing unit where it's locked down, and I was in it, and I had a celly one time, man, and he just would stay on stay in the door, try to talk all day. And it's like this it interrupts everything that, first of all, you in an uncertain situation, because 9 times out of 10 when you go to the special housing unit, you don't know your duration. You haven't got your incident report yet. So it's kind of like you got all these uncertainties going on here. So you want calm. And this is the tragedy of it, though. I ain't gonna lie, because now you putting people together, and the only way you separate them is that they have an incident or they start fighting and they scuffling, and you come in there, you spray mace, you do all this. So it's like you getting taxed double, double time, because now you not only you gonna get mace and they're gonna come beat you up, but now you're gonna get another incident report and possibly stay in the shoot longer. So the people that make these policies really is not looking at the humane side, and I believe that's what this conversation is about, to bring the humanity back to the conversation and come up with some alternative ways than this extreme lockdowns.
So there's a lot of other impacts of lockdowns. We've talked about one, which is being alone with the same person for long periods of time, but there's a whole bunch of other impacts that the lockdown has that we probably don't think about. And my next interview was with Donald Farabee, also in the penitentiary in the Hazleton Penitentiary, West Virginia. So he's going to give a lot of examples.
Because of the amount of lockdowns we're having, the inmates are unable to program. Program is one of the main things that we need in order to lower our security levels and get out of the penitentiaries to the FCIs. So if we're constantly being locked down, we're not being allowed to program, which means we're not able to lower our security statuses in any way. On top of that, the weekends are the main days that our family members are off, which means every other prison normally allows us to have visits on weekends. Here, we're only allowed to have visits on Mondays and Tuesdays. Now, on top of that, every federal holiday, we don't have a visit. So now you're forcing our family to come for a half a day after they've got to take a day off.
This call is from a federal prison.
After they've taken a day off from work to come see us. So that's really one of the most major things that happening with these particular lockdowns, not to mention the medical, because by us not coming up until 10 o'clock, we're running on a half a day in the penitentiary. So now all of these guys who may have medical issues, whether it's getting lab work done or getting x-rays done, they're being prolonged for weeks and weeks and weeks at a time. You have guys here who have had broken bones who were never even taken to medical. I think I had one of the guys actually two of the guys email you who had broken, they actually had broken feet. Each one of them had a broken foot, which made it even harder for them to just do daily, day-to-day things like walking to child. Because it's no way for us to get to medical. So if a guy we have guys here who have documented with the staff that they need to see medical, the swelling is too severe. They're being told, well, medical's not here, or medical's on a unit, or things as small as dental. You have the dental hygienist. She works the units more than she works in actual medical. So this is one of the reasons why the guys who need dental care aren't able to get their teeth cleaned or it becomes a thing of, if you don't need a tooth extraction everything else gets pushed behind. So I mean, just something as small as just yearly dental cleanings. We're 6, 7 years behind, literally.
There's another part of the interview with Donald that I found particularly interesting. And remember, at Hazleton, they use a lot of modified lockdowns. And actually, what's interesting about that is I think that the reason why they focus on modified so much is because they don't have to report it as a lockdown. So, for instance, when I went to Senator Manchin's office to try to get him to intervene with a lot of the problems at Hazleton, and I mentioned lockdowns, and he went to the BOP staff, and they said, "Oh, no, 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 we weren't locked down that many days, and it's because it was only parts of days."
Right.
But as Donald talks about next, that inconsistency of schedule, which is what a modified lockdown is, you're out, then you're in, you're out, and then you're in, and you're not really even quite sure when each starts and ends. That can have a very bad effect on mental health, and that's what he talks about.
Take me. Like, I've been incarcerated for the last 28 years. My whole bid is based on scheduling. Scheduling is what keeps us, we know what we have to do. We know where we need to be. See, right now, I have a job. I'm one of the few guys here who actually have a job. But even having a job, I'm not sure what time to wake up. I'm not sure what time I'm going to come out my cell. I'm not sure what time I'm going to work. This throws off your sleep pattern. Because guys, sometimes they may open the door at 10 o'clock. Sometimes they may open at 12 o'clock. Sometimes it may not open at all. So now a person, you have to have some type of structure. Without structure, if you don't have structure, Ms. Bailey, you're going to have anarchy. It just is what it is. And that's the main problem here at USP Hazleton. There's no structure.
Yes, man, the brother, he made a very violent point because consistency is a key and make all of us really productive in life. I remember when I was down Coleman, as I said previously, down Coleman too. And when I was down Coleman too, I worked in the laundry for 7 years. I was able to work for 7 years, gaining not only the social skills, but the work ethic of getting up early morning, right? And this is why I'm able to thrive now because I'm used to getting up early in the morning, going to work, and I had a schedule. You know, I get up 6 o'clock in the morning, I go to work, I start work at 7:30, I get off at 1:30. So I had a daily routine and schedule that helped develop me and learn, and it helped me not only from a personal standpoint of view, but even from a business standpoint of view, because I did everything when I was in the laundry. I was able to do the clerk, the washing, the folding. I even did the pay slips. So in understanding this, without these experience, I wouldn't be able to come out here and understand how a work environment to have a work relationship. Um, my two supervisors was females, so it was giving me that rapport with authority and understanding how to work with authority. And when you have these inconsistencies or these long lockdowns, you don't develop these skills. And a lot of who we are as persons is learned experience, right? We the sum total of our experience. So if we don't have this experience, then how will we ever grow and evolve? So he made a very violent point about consistency, and consistency is part of the development.
Yeah, and it's interesting because when I recently had a lot of the individuals in prison keep what I call a lockdown diary for me, so I could see what it actually looks like on a day-to-day basis. And very often at Hazleton, they'd be saying they normally would be let out of their cells at 6:30 in the morning. They're saying, no, it's like now it's like 9:30 or it's 10 in the morning. And that may sound like a small difference, but to them, no, this is my schedule. I want to get up early and get out. And that's when you may be going to programming. We may be going to medical. You may be, going to a job. But going out just those few hours later and not knowing the night before that's going to happen is really disruptive.
Wow, that's a lot of information to take in for one segment. So we're going to end right there on part one, and we're going to pick up next time on this discussion. But the next time on the discussion, we're going to deal more with the why, right? Why they locked down. And so I want you all to stay tuned because it has a very dramatic ending to this episodes. So I want y'all to tune in, and I want y'all to also subscribe because you don't want to miss it.